Well, so as I mentioned earlier, just again for the audience, I discovered your work through this video that was recommended to me. And I think the title is Individual versus Collective, which is better for humanity? And this was a Chinese New Year presentation that you did. It's like a 30-minute video, just um, you having tea and talking about the differences between individualism and collectivism. And I think it's a very impressive piece of content. So we'll link it to the show notes here for people to check out. But I was, this piqued my interest because clearly this is a dichotomy we talk about a lot as well on this show. So I thought it would be a useful discussion for you and I just to sit down and work our way through some of these topics for the audience.
Right.
I think you kind of started with collectivism in your video, but I'm going to go individual, then collectivism.
Okay.
And we'll just see which way it goes here. So, as you open the video, you describe individualism as something that's, I don't know what we call this, a philosophy, I guess, really focused on the supremacy of individual freedom, the intrinsic worth of the individual. And this is something, a philosophy, I guess it's traditionally contained within schools of thought like libertarianism or anarchism, even free market capitalism in its purest sense.
In its purest sense, yeah.
Although we don't really have that anywhere, just kind of a theory, it would be based on individualism as well. So maybe we just start there. Can I just get I'll go ahead and ruin the video for people too, but we both lean individual, I guess. So how have you established that worldview for yourself that's centered on individualism above collectivism?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's in a way the idea of versus is probably a little bit misleading. So we can sort of talk about that later. But because I think that the idea is that the individual is the sort of a priori truth of collectives. The collective is defined by the individual.
Yeah.
So the individual by definition comes first. The individual is the supreme moral unit, in my opinion.
Yes, I like that term, by the way, moral unit. I've called it the individual is the elementary particle of society, but moral unit's even better.
And you could probably move a layer beneath individuals and look at nature. So you could sort of, you could stagger it, and we can sort of talk about that later. But if we talk about the individual, well, first and foremost, the individual is the creator of all reality, in the sense of, well, we can talk about quantum theory and the idea of the observer being a creator of reality. But even if we put that to one side, I mean, essentially we are living in a sort of gray soup of information, right? And we are receiving that information, and we are creating experience, through our senses. And so in its most basic form, all of our experience of reality comes from the individual, and comes from our interpretation of this data through our senses. Then, once you've established that, you can also say that any action or any planning of any sort is done by an individual. It's never done by a collective. You don't plan as a collective; you plan as an individual. You act as an individual. Decisions are made by individuals. The consequences of those decisions impact the individual. They never impact the collective. So if you just strip it all down, the individual has to be the supreme unit. And also, if you look at the idea of knowledge, and the learning, the gaining of knowledge, the storing of knowledge, or the narratives that we create to disseminate knowledge or wisdom through generations, that is, again, all done by the self. It's never done by a collective. And so for all of these reasons, I think that the individual is the primary unit. and is the predecessor of collectives, or it is the individual that defines the collective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really well said. And it somewhat intuitive, I think, when you put it that way, that of course the individual is the only one that actually has senses, right? We are relating to reality through our senses. A collective doesn't have senses, right? It's just this useful fiction that individuals have narrativized or written to, as you said, to help disseminate knowledge. I would also add in there just to help coordinate people, right? We use useful fictions all the time to help coordinate and communicate. Language itself is a useful fiction, right? What's the old Taoist saying, that the moon and the finger that points at it are not the same thing, right? Words are just pointers to meaning. So we're immersed in this, I think you called it the gray soup of information. I would say a lot of that information is contained in these useful fictions, but there's this danger where we start to mistake the representation for reality itself. And that's where you leave individualism and go into something like collectivism, where, the nation, do it for the fatherland or the motherland or for your company or whatever imagined structure we put together. And we start to ascribe it human-like qualities, right? That it can think and act and plan. That's where the disconnect occurs. So, and to your great point, obviously, in physical reality, only individuals are bounded and distinct. They're using means to pursue ends. They're making decisions. They're engaging with reality. So, what is that danger? Is this something like a tribal instinct, perhaps, that we start to confuse our representations of reality with reality itself? Or, because it seems like we've fallen down this trap many times throughout human history.
Yeah, I think that the formation of collectives, in a way, is a natural process. I think that we need to step back a little bit and also say that the individual, what I don't want to say is that the individual is some sort of isolated, distinct entity.
Right.
Right. Of course, the individual is relational.
Yes.
Right. We're related to nature. We're related to our environment. Everything about our environment affects us as we affect it. And so there's always going to be relations happening. Right. And you could also sort of talk about ideas of extended mind theory, where your phone is part of yourself, or you could sort of talk about, well, you can always talk about the interconnected nature of things. But from a pragmatic point of view, I think that you can say that the individual is concrete. You can look at Buddhist ideas of the individual, and its sort of ephemeral nature. But I think from a pragmatic point of view, in this discussion, we can talk about the individual as connected. But relations are very, very important. And so naturally, we form relations. And one of the things that, I often hear is that the Eastern way of living is a more collective way of living, versus the Western way. But I think it's sort of confused. Obviously, there's lots of different things we could talk about. There's a big difference between Confucianism and communism, for example, right? So Confucianism talks about relationships. It's the supremacy of relationships over the individual. But that, I think, is different from the supremacy of collectives over individual. Like the idea that your relationship with your family or the groups around you are very important is, I think, I would agree with that. That's a natural way to go. Now, eventually, you are going to need to cooperate. Right. And that cooperation means you're going to get groups of people. And with that cooperation, you're going to need to create some sort of shared purpose, right? Some sort of shared
values.
Shared values. Exactly. So you look at the value of the collective in terms of its function, or you look at the values of the collective in terms of its sort of moral compass, if you like, right? And so these are all natural tendencies. So this is why I think it's misleading to say individual versus collective, even though that's what I did, because it's a nice YouTube title. the idea is that the individual is the primary unit. It will naturally form collectives. The problem is the corruption that happens in the formation of collectives if they are not governed properly. Governed is probably not the right word, but baked into the formation of the collective needs to be some sort of method of anti-corruption, right? And you know, we see this in terms of democracy and, you know, ideals of how we can try to instill anti-corruption. And obviously, you know, Bitcoin is the very unique situation where that it literally is baked in,
right,
and it can't be taken away, which is why it's so magical and such a beautiful thing. Yeah, so I think there's a natural tendency to form collectives, but I think that if you follow that natural tendency, there should be a natural tendency for the splintering of those collectives.
Right.
In other words, you should create cooperative groups for a sort of aim, but those aims will always be shifting.
Right.
So you've got to keep your radar up, right? Because the purpose of a collective is very hard to define,
yes,
and will often get steered by individuals that can lead it to places where you've got essentially a group that's working on behalf of individuals rather than genuine collective good. And so essentially what I think needs to happen is you need to have the right kind of startup for these collectives, but that is a very difficult thing to do, right? Because inevitably the collectives sort of take a life of their own, and herds start to develop, and tribes start to form, and you start to get all of the classical fallout from that herd mentality, exclusionism, dogma, and lots of other things that we can talk about in terms of, you know, when we sort of critique, you know, the problems with collectives. But I do think it's a natural tendency that we do form collectives to achieve aims. The problem is that we should not be protecting those collectives. We should be protecting the individual. And I think that that's where we've got our wires crossed a little bit.
Yeah, and you mean specifically when you say protecting collectives, I assume that means the political apparatus protecting collectives. Is that what you mean?
It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It could even be on a smaller level than that. The point is that when you have collectives, there is a tendency for people to want to ring fence power, right? So the idea being that the people who exert the most influence on the collective get used to exerting that influence, and they don't want it to end.
Yes.
Right. And then that influence inevitably becomes a bit selfish, and they start to say, well, I'm going to make decisions for the greater good, but the greater good just happens to also help me, right?
Yeah, of course.
Or help my buddies over there.
Yeah.
And so you have a problem there, which and the problem is that the people who have that control obviously don't want to lose it.
Yeah.
And so they therefore create structures that either political structures, but it could be other structures as well.
Yeah.
Financial structures. It could be, you know, moral structures potentially. They create structures that protect the collective, but essentially protect their own sort of control and domination. And that is where I think the key problem, or the key flaw in collectives is, and it needs to be flagged, and it needs to be a red flag, and it needs to be something that is constantly looked at, because if we allow that to happen, then you run into all sorts of problems.